And so it continues. Hello, ladies and gentlemen from all around the world. My name is The Advocate, and today I'm an advocate for Words of Radiance, a book review. No beating around the bush, let's get right to it. Released on March 4, 2014, Words of Radiance is the sequel to Brandon Sanderson's critically acclaimed novel known as The Way of Kings. It is the second book in a planned 10-book epic, yowza, known as the Stormlight Archive. Does Words of Radiance hold up to the epic standards set by its predecessor? Well, stay tuned to find out. However, before we get into the action, if you guys could do me a huge favor and leave me a like, comment, and consider subscribing to my channel as well, I would really appreciate it. Your engagement really does help me out, and I couldn't be more grateful. And while you're clicking that subscribe button, if you wouldn't mind also taking a look at my previous book review video with regards to The Way of Kings, I would also really appreciate it. Not only for my benefit, but also because we will be referencing quite a few things from The Way of Kings in the first part of this video. So if you don't want spoilers from that book, then definitely watch that video before watching this one. As far as this video goes, we'll be talking spoilers for Words of Radiance in the second part of this video. So definitely click on the timestamps below to access different spoiler-free and different spoiler-full sections of the video. With all that said, let's go. So I think the biggest question going into this book is Words of Radiance a worthy follow-up to The Way of Kings? From my perspective, yeah, I think this book is a very worthy follow-up. If you as a reader enjoyed The Way of Kings and are fully on board with Sanderson's Cosmere hype train, then there's really no reason why you shouldn't check Words of Radiance out. Now, if your follow-up question to that is Words of Radiance a better book than The Way of Kings? Then my answer is a bit more complicated, and I would say yes and no. When judging Words of Radiance as a whole, I can't help but look back fondly on this book, which is saying a lot considering the sheer size of this 1,300 plus page tome. Seeing how many things are paid off by the conclusion of this book definitely makes what is a significant time investment worth it for the reader. In addition, I feel like there's a lot more intrigue going on in the background of this story that wasn't necessarily present in the first book, which I think makes it a more exciting book by comparison. Shallan in particular gets into quite a few lore-intensive situations, and it's very interesting to see how questions of the world, aka Rashar, slowly unfold through her eyes in the present. Nevertheless, despite the subjectively more exciting story, I think Words of Radiance does have a few more glaring elements here that I'm not too keen on when compared to The Way of Kings. In my previous video, I commented that despite greatly enjoying The Way of Kings, I did very much feel like I was reading a very long book, and although I also greatly enjoyed reading Words of Radiance, my complaints regarding the book's length are actually a little worse here. Not only do I believe that this book feels its length, but to me this book actually feels longer than its already long 1,300 page length. And a big part of that actually comes down to the structure of this book. Similar to Book 1, Sanderson provides act breaks via these interlude chapters that happen throughout the book, which function as a way to break up the action of the main story and give Sanderson a bit more breathing room to expand on Rashar's lore through the perspective of interlude POV characters. Now, these interlude chapters didn't particularly bother me in Book 1, as I understood what Sanderson was trying to go for, and the interlude chapters were rarely longer than 10 pages each. However, this book has some fairly lengthy interludes, and although there are moments of intrigue here and there, Sanderson definitely tests my patience with some of these chapters. I know Sanderson is slowly planting seeds for other characters who we don't quite yet know about to come into the fold later on in this story, but with the exception of Szeth Sunsun Villano and a specific Parshendi character who, by the by, I love everything to do with her POV perspective, I personally have found it difficult to invest myself in these other, as of now, less interesting POVs. The stories for most of these interlude characters are so far removed, both plot-wise and geographically, from our main cast of characters that it's a bit of a challenge for me to devote my energy to their tales when I have very little to no context to go off of. Their presence in the book often does feel like a momentum stopper, and I did have to power through some of these chapters which occasionally border on unnecessarily long. I feel that if Sanderson did want to plant seeds for future characters, he would have been better suited to either promoting some of these POVs to more prevalent POV status, thus giving us more chapters and more context for their stories every time we cut back to them, or just cutting them out of the book entirely and providing these interlude stories in separate novellas, that way providing us a neat and concise place to basically read about these interlude characters without necessarily interrupting the main story. Now, I'm sure at some point in the future, when all 10 Stormlight books have been released and we have the full context for these interlude characters, I'm likely going to appreciate these interludes a lot more on a reread. However, as of this moment, having only read the first 2 Stormlight books and only having those as context for these interludes, my opinion remains fairly low on them. But okay, so I'm not a fan of the interludes. What's new? What about the main story itself? Does it hold up? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's more intrigue going on with this book, which I think does wonders in giving an already good story more meat on the bone. In the previous book, we were given an insight into Kaladin's character and how he became the man he became. This book, for sure, continues to develop Kaladin as he grows into his role as one of Dalinar's soldiers, but we are also now given an additional character insight, this time by delving into Shallan's past and seeing how her backstory has shaped who she is. And I'm all for it. Shallan Davar is front and center in this book, and her family history, in addition to her current desire to learn more about the Ghostbloods, keeping things relatively spoiler-free here, definitely raises some interesting lore questions that keeps things engaging for the reader as we attempt to seek answers to these questions. On top of that, I just really like Shallan's character, and her personality definitely injects this story with some very enjoyable humor. Additionally, Dalinar and Adolin, who I felt were rather second fiddle in the Way of Kings, have more to do here as their roles as Alethi war camp leaders function to both move the Alethi army and the plot forward. Without delving too deeply into spoilers, there's a race against the clock element here in this story, and seeing Dalinar and Adolin advance the story whilst attempting to navigate that race definitely makes for a compelling read. Now, although I have nothing but praise for the main story, I do take issue with a few of Sanderson's narrative choices in this book. I'll cover this more deeply in the spoilers section, but there's a specific trope that Sanderson delves into in this book that I see all the time in movies and books, and I just don't like it. Honestly, I'm kind of disappointed that Sanderson delves into this trope, and I'll expand more on this later on in this video. Another thing I'm not too big on, and I'm sure this is mostly a personal preference, is the inclusion of bad guy POVs in books. I'm gonna keep things vague here, but Sadeas has a few POV chapters in this book, and every time I see them, I groan a little bit. When Sadeas reveals his admittedly thinly veiled true colors in the Way of Kings, it feels like a genuinely big moment in the story. This character, who publicly doubles down on his commitment to Dalinar only to, in the end, betray him, is a very nicely done twist. Now imagine if instead of keeping Sadeas quiet throughout that book, Sanderson had included a number of Sadeas POVs where he openly talks about his plans to undermine Dalinar and leave him stranded on the tower. That certainly would have taken the sting out of the reveal now, wouldn't it? Now, to be fair, Sadeas' perspective takes up maybe about 2% of Words of Radiance, and he keeps things relatively close to his chest, so he's not disclosing any big-time future spoilers here. But the fact that we even see Sadeas planning and thinking it all to begin with, I feel like it's just a little too much. Additionally, I'm also not personally that big of a fan of his writing, as I find Sadeas to be a rather one-note villain. And even though there are other antagonistic POVs within the story, such as Szeth, I find Szeth and those other antagonists to be more layered than your stereotypical, I'm evil and I want to rule the world shtick.
A Lethkar does need to be strong, Sadeas said, holding out a gauntlet in hand, so I'll make it so by force of fist and the rule of blood.
Speaking of the world, similar to the first book, I absolutely love how Sanderson approaches his fantastical world of Roshar from a very scientific perspective. Just to give a few examples, the animals and plant life on Roshar have very purposeful designs, the timing of weather systems can be calculated with mathematical formulas, and despite the complexity of this world's religion, a lot of the cause and effect relationships in Roshar ultimately boil down to the relationship between the supernatural spren and the planet's natural organisms. It's a very cool way to build the world in a genre where grounding a story isn't really necessary. There's a logic to the way Rashar works, and I respect the heck out of Sanderson for tangibly expounding on how every little detail on this planet works. And on the topic of details, Sanderson's descriptive abilities in bringing a world to life have certainly improved over time, especially when we compare his writing style here to that of Mistborn: The Final Empire. I mean, no, Sanderson's writing isn't going to win any poetry contest, but his ability to marry a character's emotional state of mind with the nature around them makes for a very fun read.
Light streamed down from the surface in shimmering radiant columns. There was life here. Furious, amazing life. Tiny fish zipped this way and that, picking at the underside of the shell that shaded a majestic creature. The beast itself was a knotted gray-blue mass underneath the shell. Its ancient-looking folds surrounded one large eye on her side, presumably its twin would be on the other side. It seemed ponderous, yet majestic, with mighty fins moving like oarsmen.
Sanderson's writing is minimalistic, but he does just enough for the reader to see and feel what a character sees and feels. It's a great use of utilitarian description. But you know what else is great? Us delving into spoilers! If you have not read Words of Radiance, then definitely feel free to click on the timestamps below to skip ahead to the conclusion of this video because we're about to talk spoilers. If you have read Words of Radiance, stick around because we got some discussing to do. So, similar to The Way of Kings, our long journey throughout this book is rewarded greatly with some rather fantastic final chapters. Let's start with Szeth and Kaladin's climactic final battle as they duel in the sky amongst a backdrop of two high storms. One your typical Rasharan hurricane in the middle of the weeping, and the other a very powerful Everstorm unleashed by our Parshendi friends. And I gotta say, this is one of the coolest battlegrounds, or battle skies, that I've ever read in fantasy. As we've mentioned previously, Sanderson is no poet. His writing style isn't bad, but he doesn't particularly care to give you all the detail in the world. However, when the action heats up and people's lives are on the line, Sanderson cracks his literary knuckles and goes to work because, as is the case with his other works, Sanderson is a peculiar strong suit when it comes to writing action. On top of that, this strong suit is further amplified when nature and human emotion combine to complement said action, giving us a memorable setting for a memorable battle.
Storms crashed together beneath Kaladin. The clouds broke apart, black, red, and gray mingling in enormous swirls, lightning arcing among them. It seemed to be Aharietiam again, the ending of all things. Szeth flew by in a sweeping flash of silvery metal. Kaladin deflected the blow, the spear in his hand vibrating with a plangent ding. Szeth continued on, passing him, and Kaladin lashed himself in that direction. They fell westward, skimming the tops of the clouds, though to Kaladin's eyes that direction was down.
It's good stuff all around. However, it's not the only thing that happens here in this ending, as in addition to Kaladin making strides in his Windrunner abilities in battle, Dalinar also makes huge strides in his development in becoming a bondsmith, as after so much buildup, he finally assembles the Avengers. Well, partially assembles, as this is still very much a war against a storm full of destruction kind of situation, but Dalinar's founding of the Knights Radiance is such a cool payoff. Looking ahead, there seems to be an intriguing number of possibilities for this Knights Radiant storyline, as having a quartet of superheroes in the story means we're likely in for some awesome multi-character Stormlight battles in the future. And again, going back to that epic Szeth Kaladin battle, magic action scenes seem to be Sanderson's forte. It seems that there's a lot of development going around for our main cast of characters, which inevitably brings us to our dear friend Adolin. Oh boy. Sanderson's slow burn deconstruction of Adolin throughout the first two books reaches a pivotal stepping stone, or more accurately a stooping stone, when Adolin stoops slow and unexpectedly yet rather gruesomely kills Sadeas, paying off what up to this point had been a growing dark side within Adolin's character. I did not see this one coming, but it makes sense within the context of the story, especially given how much time Sanderson has spent in reminding the reader that Adolin has a short fuse, and that fuse has been burning and burning for a long while now, so it was inevitable that we would reach our explosion here at the end.
Adolin Kholin, this is a duel, not a wrestling match. Did I break any rules? He shouted back. Did I break any rules? Adolin demanded again. This is not how a duel, so I win, Adolin said. I'll have your throat in my hands, Sadius, Adolin hissed. I'll squeeze and squeeze, and I'll sink my dagger into your gut and twist. A quick death is too good for you. My father, Adolin said with a grunt, sweat from his nose dripping down onto the blade of the knife, thinks I'm a better man than he is. He strained and felt Sadius's grip weaken. Unfortunately for you, he's wrong, Sadius whimpered. With a surge, Adolin forced the blade up past Sadius's nose and into the eye socket, piercing the eye like a ripe berry, then rammed it home into the brain. Sadius shook for a moment, blood pooling around the blade as Adolin worked it to be certain.
Despite the brutality, I actually really like the heel turn here, as it adds an additional level of potential intrigue for our main crew of protagonists. Adolin is no stranger to bumping heads with Kaladin, but now that Adolin has embraced a new darker side to his personality, I'm curious to see how his new aggressive persona will clash with Dalinar or even Shallan, who up to this point has only seen the best in Adolin. There's also a part of me that wants to see Adolin develop into a full-blown villain, as the main character conflict intertwined with family dynamics makes for some rather interesting storyline possibilities, especially if Adolin does indeed develop into a surge binder based on the descriptive use of the word surge during his murder of Sadius. But we'll just have to wait and see. There's a lot of potential here, and I'm keen to read what Adolin gets up to next. As far as Sadius' early exit from the series goes, I think it ultimately works out for the best, as again, Sadius' villainous personality has always felt rather hollow to me. His death leaves a space for other more interesting antagonists to come into the fold, such as Amaram, who has a rather interesting goal in wanting to bring back the Voidbringers, and Moash, who has a personal story with Kaladin. Either of these makes for a more fascinating conflict, and it's honestly to the story's benefit. Now, speaking of deaths, although I'm always game to see how an author uses death as a potentially powerful storytelling tool, I'm not always a fan of the execution. Or, more accurately, the non-execution, and I think you guys know where I'm going with this. I did not like Jasna Kolin's fake-out death. The reveal that Jasna had been hiding out in Shadesmar the whole time during her quote-unquote death feels like such a cop-out, and I am not a fan. I really dislike it when writers of any medium pull this, aha, he or she has come back to life, we can be happy again stunt. Fake-out deaths are so worn out by nonfiction, and I'm disappointed that Sanderson delved into this cliche for this book. Jasna Kolin's original death on the ship was fine. It worked at both making the reader feel genuine sadness to see the end of this endearing Type A character, and at pushing Shallan's character to grow into an independent woman who no longer had Jasna's hand to hold for safety. It was a sad but well-written send-off. For Sanderson to double back on that and be like, nah, psych, killing her off is too sad, she's actually been alive the whole time and is coming back into the fold. It feels so unsatisfying. Sanderson wanted to have his cake by eliciting an emotional response from the reader when Jasna dies, and eat it too by ultimately keeping her alive and not losing any main characters in the process. It's rather cheap and also fairly dampens the drama for the upcoming books, because now if someone dies, I can't even be sure if that person is actually going to stay dead or if they're coming back to life. It's disappointing. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not a heartless monster who wants to read a book where all the main characters die, but I am definitely of the mindset that if an author doesn't have an interest in killing off a particular character, then the author shouldn't bother being cute with their fate. Either commit to fully killing off your character or don't. This whole in-between nonsense is played out. But on a more interesting note, I suppose Jasna's got a shard blade now, so we'll see what her reintroduction means for the Knights Radiant going forward. And that's honestly one of the coolest things about this book, is how many things it sets up for the coming novels. When I first read The Way of Kings, I was a little confused as to how Sanderson would draw this series out to encompass 10 books. But the more I read, the more I realized that we've only scratched the surface of the Stormlight world, as there's definitely more breathing room here for Sanderson to write 10 back-to-back books. But regardless of what's to come, I still think this book stands on its own merits and is a very compelling read despite some of my complaints. In addition to the plot elements I've already praised, there are some other great highlights that happen throughout the book. We have Syl and Kaladin's ongoing back and forth friendship. We have Adolin's disadvantaged duel with 4 other shard bearers. We have the full story behind the death of Shallan's parents, and we have the introduction of Pattern, who I absolutely love and adore, and I'm always game to hearing him speak in his robotic yet childlike way. It's fantastic. However, what about you guys? Do you guys agree with my assessment on this book? Definitely let me know in the comment section down below, and I look forward to engaging with you guys on this topic. So all in all, Words of Radiance is a great story and a more than worthy follow-up to The Way of Kings. I'm not totally on board with a few of Sanderson's narrative choices, and the interludes are rather hit and miss, but I think this story's intrigue in combination with expectations of what's to come makes Words of Radiance a must-read, especially if you're already invested in the Cosmere. But with all that said, thank you so very much for watching this video, guys. I really do appreciate it. You guys are too awesome, and I can't thank you enough. Despite my curiosity about the next book in the Stormlight Archive, I think I'm actually going to take a little bit of a break from the series and go and read Warbreaker, as that will be my next book review video. I have been informed that Oathbringer, Book 3 in the Stormlight Archive, has a few spoiler elements from Warbreaker, so I think my best course of action is to read that book so that I'm as Stormlight literate as possible. I also recently acquired the Edge Dancer novella, which I will also read after Warbreaker. It's a handful, I know, but I really want to do the Stormlight justice, and the best way to do that justice is by reading the prerequisite material before hopping back into Oathbringer. But I'll keep you guys posted in the community tab with updates on my reading progress and my future book review videos. Nevertheless, until then, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time. The Advocate, out.